And we are delighted that everyone has joined us this evening, along with Elise Goldman, who is the Chief Officer of Education Information and of the historic Patterson National Landmark Patterson Falls. She has a presentation of about 40 minutes, and then she'll take questions at the end. Or if you have questions, please use the chat feature so that she can take the questions at the end. You may have your question answered by the fact that the presentation has a lot of information in it. So that's really exciting. So on behalf of Temple Israel, I want to welcome everyone here from the synagogues or all those interested parties that.
You're muted, Bob. Bob, you're muted.
I'm unmuted now. Okay, so we're there. All right, Elise, why don't you begin?
Okay, great, thank you. So on behalf of the National Park Service and Patterson Great Falls National Historical Park, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me here to speak a little bit about the National Park Service in general, Patterson Great Falls in specific, and some of our future plans. As Bob said, my name is Elise Goldman, and I'm the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Volunteers at the Great Falls. And so what does that mean? Basically, if you've been to a national park and you see the rangers giving the tours and, you know, answering questions and things like that, that's the division that I'm honored to head up over at the Great Falls. So I have this blank screen here because usually what I like to do, you know, in participatory fashion is to find out, you know, what national parks people have been to. If you do want to try to put that in the chat, I can actually see chat. So what kind of national parks have you all been to?
Sequoia.
Okay, we got to vote for Sequoia.
Oh, also Grand Canyon and
Canyon de Chelly.
Yellowstone.
Yellowstone.
We got Zion, Canyon de Chelly,
Zion.
Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Yosemite. So,
Factory.
oh, Edison's Factory and Wapiti, very
Been
nice.
there.
So now we're getting some of the parks that aren't actually national in origin, not the national park designation. And that's something I kind of wanted to focus on a bit. So let's talk about the national parks. So did we all know that the Statue of Liberty was a national park?
Yes.
Good. Mount Rushmore. And of course, the Grand Canyon. That now we're getting into things that people tend to know about national parks. This is out on Fire Island National Seashore. And we have Sagamore Hill National Historic Site out on Long Island. That's Theodore Roosevelt's home. And all of these different units, even though they have different designations, they're all part of the National Park Service. And if you look at our logo, it tells you everything you really need to know about what our job is. Yes, we protect trees in our national parks and the ecosystems, plants. We protect landforms like mountains and canyons and waterfalls, which is exhibited by this little lake here. So we pretty much have the natural treasures down. But then people have put in there in the chat places like Wapiti, people put in there like Morristown, and those are more historic in nature. Does anybody see in this logo?
You muted yourself, Elise.
Thank you. Does anybody see in this logo right here what would indicate that national parks also take care of people's history, their stories? It's a trick.
The buffalo.
So the bison it could definitely represent, you know, hunting, which is definitely a people thing. But you also want to take
the
a look
arrowhead
at the outside, which is the arrowhead. So the arrowhead here represents people's stories. And a lot of folks tend to think that all national parks, for the most part, they are in the West and they all start with Y, you know, Yellowstone, Yosemite. But in fact, 2/3 of our national parks actually do feature the history, and most of them are east of the Mississippi and not west. In fact, but the Western parks, they beat us out on land. So this is our national park system. And any place that you see black writing anywhere is a national park site. We have 423 park units, and I'm sorry, and this is our main responsibility. It's in the Organic Act, and it tells us basically that we preserve the natural and historic features and all the wildlife so that people can benefit and enjoy them for all time, which is a very interesting type of mission, in that we have to conserve and protect, but we also want you to enjoy. So I kind of feel sometimes, no, come in and enjoy, but don't touch, don't touch. So you could see, so our rangers, we do have an interesting time of it. And I think that's why so many of us are drawn to this, this mission, because it seems very challenging to be able to make people happy, but also to protect our national treasures. Okay, why isn't this moving? Okay, so national parks are places where we want you to connect. So we want you to see the beauty that's around you. We want you to learn the history. We want you to feel the stories, but we want you to make these meaningful connections. We want to make sure that your great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren will be able to see the places that you were able to see and experience in exactly the same way. Some of the numbers that I thought was a little bit, interesting is here. One of the things that I find particularly important is that visitor spending contributes about $40 billion to the nation's economy. So we are also, even though it's not part of our prime directive, if you will, it is definitely a benefit. So we have 423 individual units with different designations. So if you say that I've been to all the national parks, you're probably talking about things like Grand Canyon National Park, Everglades National Park. But if you've been to all of them, then you'll realize that there are historical parks and sites and monuments and lake shores and seashores and national trails and reserves. And I've been asked this question a lot, someday do you hope to work at a real park? Which, yeah, it can be irritating, except what you need to know is that all national parks are special, and there is no difference to the degree at which we are expected to take care of them for the benefit and enjoyment of future generations. Really, the names just signify either what they're talking about or how they got into the agency, either by Congress or an act of the president. More numbers for you. The largest park is Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska, and the smallest is actually a bedroom of Kosciuszko, a Rev War hero, and that's in Philadelphia. We're about 20,000 professionals, and pretty much any job that exists out in the quote unquote real world, you can pretty much find that position in the National Park Service. We maintain just under 900 visitor centers. 500,000 people attend special programs. That's, your park tours. We have a huge educational mission. The agency is responsible for caring for about 80 million museum objects. Anybody know where this picture was taken? Yes.
Patterson Museum.
That is the Patterson Museum, and one of my favorite exhibits. We do have special programs, not only for the school group set, but also for kids dropping in with their families. We call them the Junior Ranger program, and some of them, like this young lady here, gets very into it. And when they collect their Junior Ranger badges from all 423 units, they do get highlighted in internal correspondence. So it's a very pride moment for them. We do have a robust volunteer program. About 8 million hours are donated to the national parks each year. They are certainly value added in more ways than one. And we do have a volunteer program, and we are very grateful for the time that they put in. This picture is actually from a mitzvah day that we hosted at the park. The National Park Service also takes care of the National Historic Landmark Program, National Register of Historic Places. So if you've ever seen the Flatiron Building in New York City and you see the little plaque, it does indeed say that it is a National Historic Landmark. But you won't see a ranger there because, it's just part of that program, but it's not raised to national park status. I show these pictures because Paterson has quite a few of these designations. Henchlift Stadium is a National Historic Landmark, which is considered one step below national park status. Our Raceway System, which we'll talk about a little more in detail, which powered the mills, that's a National Engineering Landmark. The entire Great Falls Historic District is a National Historic District, and of course the Great Falls and part of Garrett Mountain just across the way is part of a National Natural Landmark District. So we pretty much have them all. We work with lots of partners. Patterson Great Falls is a partnership park. So what that means is that we don't have to do everything ourselves. We work with a lot of private nonprofits, the schools, friends groups, the general public to make the park successful and to provide innovative programming. It also means that we don't have to own everything in the park, because we could provide expertise in certain areas to the city or the state that owns some land that borders the park, and other organizations, other public agencies can help take care of that mission, which works out best for everybody. We do have other cooperating associations like bookstores that we tend to house in our visitor centers. The National Park Foundation is our official support arm, and they give us, about $120 million a year. We also have a Rivers, Trails, and Conservation program. It's a grassroots program. So if you're living in a neighborhood where you would like to reclaim an area for public use as a trail, you could contact the folks at the Rivers, Trails Conservation program, and they will provide assistance in you setting up your own grassroots organization to help bring that trail to fruition. We also work with many tribes. In fact, just this afternoon, I was speaking with the Delaware Nation, one of the 3 federally recognized tribes for the Patterson Great Falls, to do some programming, hopefully this summer. So keep your fingers crossed. So these are your national parks here in New Jersey. And the one that we're going to focus on is, of course, the Great Falls. So let's talk about our new national park. So it is the newest national park in New Jersey. It is not the newest national park in the system. We're 397th. And actually back on March 30th, we celebrated our 12th anniversary of President Obama actually setting aside this area to be part of the National Park Service. This is what it kind of looks like today. Some of the things that we're going to be hoping to acquire. We're such a new park that we don't even really own land yet. But the 2 main areas of the park that we are going to acquire, hopefully this year, would be Mary Ellen Kramer Park up here and Overlook Park down here. And that's really the most heavily visited places. Things around us that are part of the park boundary that will remain with the city is Henchlift Stadium, Upper Raceway Park, which again follows the path of the power system for the mills early on. The Allied Textile Printing ruins will also remain with the city. And although the Patterson Museum is in the park boundary, it is a separate entity and will be maintained by the city of Paterson. Uh-oh. Sorry. Okay. So this is what it looked like all those years ago. Very different. So you might take a look at these falls and you might ask yourself, yeah, this is really pretty and the falls are great. And, so what? Why is this included in the National Park Service? I mean, is it the tallest falls? The answer is no. It's not the tallest. It's not the widest. It's not the deepest. It isn't even the most powerful. It is the 2nd most powerful waterfall east of the Mississippi next to Niagara Falls, which I think is saying something when you see Niagara Falls. So you might say, so again, why are we so significant? So if you take a look at our national significance, just an excerpt from our founding statement, it's the park and surrounding historic district that illustrates the successful evolution of a manufacturing society which drew from the diversity and innovativeness of the American people for more than 2 centuries. So what is that? It's basically this place, Paterson, New Jersey, was set up to be the first planned industrial city whose goal it was to experiment with an industrial economy, essentially, something to put the United States on a sound footing to grow as a nation right after the Revolutionary War when we were heavily in debt. But that story is again 30,000 feet. So let's bring it back down to the more human. So I like to take this statement and break it down into its bare elements, which is we talk about the importance of the place, the people, and the products. And what you'll find is that it's the diversity of the ecosystems, the people and their ideas, and the product lines that made Patterson so successful. So if we start with the Great Falls itself, you know, it starts anywhere from tourism, which as you saw earlier is definitely, you know, an economic engine. It's got your natural history, your energy, and it's inspiring. So how is this so inspiring? Well, let's see what the place kind of looks like. You know, the third largest city in the state has a waterfall right in the center of it. And I think it's something that we can celebrate. And that's our Patterson. So how did it get here? Well, if you've ever looked at a map and you kind of the world and you kind of said, you know, it kind of looks like this place well fits together like a jigsaw puzzle, then you would be right. And you probably already know that you know, a couple of years ago, a couple of billion years ago, the continents were connected into a supercontinent known as Pangea. And we are, do you guys see my arrow? Can you give me a thumbs up if you see this arrow? Okay, good.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So right around here is where we are. And at some point, these continents, you know, broke apart. And what happens when you have land masses that kind of break apart is that you have lava that kind of, not a volcano, but lava kind of spews over the surface. And it made different mountain ranges in the area like the Watchung Mountains. So we have the rock. That's exactly how the rock got here. This is basalt. It dates back to when Pangea broke apart about 2 million years ago. And that's kind of like the Palisades. So if you've ever come across the Palisades, it's a different basalt period geologically, but it's the same type of rock. So that's how the rock got here. So now the question comes, well, how did the water get here? And for that, we have to go back 13,000 years to the glacial period. So the Wisconsinian Glacier, you probably know, covered this whole area. For this, we do need to go a little bit further west to Basking Ridge part of the world to see that there was this lake that was formed as the glaciers started to retreat. And if anybody has been to the Great Swamp Wildlife Refuge, that's where this lake used to be. And it was called Glacial Lake Passaic. And it's huge. It was huge. And as the glaciers continued to melt, it opened up some gaps in the rock formations, the Watchung Mountains, which allowed the water easy access to other locations. So the Passaic River, which actually the headwaters is actually a little further west of the Great Swamp, kind of changed its course a little bit and wound up going through Paterson. And through erosion and weathering over the years, the chasm is formed, the waterfall goes over the falls, and that's kind of how we got here. So what's special about it? Well, everybody knew that it was here. And so because of that, it got a lot of visitors over the years. And for that, we do need to talk about the people, because it was the people that were inspired, or the people that lived here who started an economy of their own that kind of tells the rest of Patterson's story. Now, this is kind of something new that I'm toying with. So tell me what you think. We're actually doing some exhibits for a new visitor center. And when I think of the people, I like to think about their entrepreneurial spirit. I like to think that the people that lived in and around Patterson were people that had grit. They saw opportunity, they pursued it regardless of what resources they already had. They saw what could be, they found a way to make it happen, and they took a lot of risks. So with that in mind, let's look at the different people. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the area, if we talked about the area and didn't mention the Lenape. The Lenape people didn't actually live in Paterson. They lived in and around it, but they definitely used the Great Falls area for hunting and fishing, as well as a spiritual place. They used to call the area Paquapic, which means the place of the noisy waters. So what was their economy? It was an environmental one. It was rich. They had edible medicinal plants. They had plenty of game to hunt. They were fishing. There were resources to build homes. And if any of you have ever been to, you're leaving Fair Lawn, you're heading into Elmwood Park, and you see like the Passaic River, you're heading into Paterson, and you see a bunch of rocks that form a V, that is the fish weir. Though we're not 100% sure if that's a European remnant or if it was built by the Lenape. Most scholars seem to think it was built by Lenape. This is kind of what it looks like here, and it's basically a method for catching fish. So we do know that they were in the area, and they're still in the area today. So that's something important to note, that the Lenape may have been forced out, but there are still tribes here in New Jersey, local tribes. The federally recognized tribes, unfortunately, were kind of forced to migrate. Basically, they're in the diaspora for a much longer period of time, but they still do come back. They work alongside of us. They ride the buses with us. A lot of them worked in the mills during Patterson's heyday. So one of the things they always tell us is, when you talk about us, please make sure that everybody knows that we're still here. We are not a remnant of the past. And neither are the Dutch. The Dutch came to this area for a lot of the same reasons as the Lenape. It was just ecologically rich. It was a perfect place to set up farming. In fact, they set up the early grid system for the city. But that's not where the Patterson history story actually starts. Some would say that it starts actually in July of 1778, which, arguably some people would call the most important picnic in history. I guess it depends on your point of view. But after the Battle of Monmouth, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and Lafayette stopped off at the Great Falls to have basically lunch on their way further west. And that wasn't unusual. As I said earlier, everybody knew about the falls. And if you were anywhere, if you had business anywhere near Patterson or what became Patterson, you made sure that you steered your horse to come see the waterfall. So what we like to say, and it's kind of apocryphal, but it's a neat story, is we like to say that this is where Alexander Hamilton was inspired to create his industrial city. Because he looked over after he was eating his meal of a hard biscuit, tongue, and grog, and looked at the waterfall and said, wow, water's really powerful, and promptly binned that thought until after the revolution. And then after that Revolutionary War was over and he was made Secretary of the Treasury, it was his job to pretty much figure out how we were going to pay the nation's debt after the Revolutionary War. And his thought is nothing, his idea is nothing really new. England was based on an industrial economy, and he figured that that could work here as well. You can imagine that this was incredibly unpopular after the Revolutionary War. So after some dealings with, debates with Thomas Jefferson, there are actually some parts of the play Hamilton that are factual. It was decided that, you know what, fine, you want to try out your idea, go try out your idea. And he needed a location to make this happen. So the perfect location would be near a major trade center or a large city, kind of like New York City, Philadelphia. It would need to have access to a power source and raw materials to build your buildings. So he sent some of his guys out to look around for such a location. And as you can see this excerpt from the letter, they think that this place is perfect. The water is good, meaning that it is fresh and it is drinkable and it's a powerful situation. And we think you should come see it. And I know this isn't true, but every time I read this, I like to sit and think that he's reading this letter at home at his dining room table and saying, oh my gosh, I totally remember that place. We had tongue and grog. And that's where the idea of situating this industrial city in Paterson comes about. So he goes over to the governor of New Jersey, William Patterson, and he says, hey, look, I have this great idea. We really want to bring business to the state. You know, what do you think? And William Patterson's thought was, yeah, like, let's do it. And we'll give you whatever you need tax-free, as a matter of fact. So how could you pass that up? So Hamilton started this kind of public-private partnership called the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, or SUM for short. And in December of 1791, he actually, they actually signed the agreement, the papers, to form the society and basically make this area a company town. And in honor of the person that allowed this to happen, the city would be named after William Patterson. So here's Paterson. We got New York, we have Philadelphia, we have water, lots of water access. And that struck one criteria. Another one was access to a power source, but it's not the falls. The power source is actually the river itself. So this is roughly taken from an area that's around the same height as the Great Falls, which is 77 feet or so. And if you notice, the city is downhill from the waterfall. It's also downhill from the river. So what happens is you take advantage of this height differential and you channel the river into these ditches, if you will, that kind of snake throughout the city, and river water running downhill very fast can power water wheels that can generate enough horsepower to power your machines. So Pierre Charles L'Enfant was the person who was given the contract by the SUM to build such a system. In fact, he was kind of given the whole contract to make the city as well. His ideas were good, but very expensive, and kind of went above and beyond what they were looking for. They wanted to get something started pretty fast to prove their point that an industrial economy is the way to go to kind of jumpstart our American economy. So eventually he was let go, and Peter Colt of the famous Colt family was told to take over. He became the superintendent of the SUM and took over the building of the power system, which is called the Raceway System. Before, you think it was just Charles L'Enfant, who was an engineer, or Peter Colt, who had some skills in that area. Both Alexander Hamilton and his father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, also had some skills in that area, and they did have some input into the design of what became known as the Raceway System. And about over a 40-year period, this raceway system grew. So here's the river. You set up a dam, you dig a channel, raceway to the first mill, you build your mill along the raceway, you have a water wheel in here. The water speeds downhill quickly, spins your water wheel, and then goes back out into the Passaic River. So that's the first. And over time, it just kept growing. This is actually something that you could see at Upper Raceway Park, just to see how the water was flowing and how things worked. This is what the raceway looked like in 2009. It wasn't that long ago that the raceways had water in it. Unfortunately, after Hurricane Irene, it pretty much tore up the lining that was in the raceway that prevented it from leaking into some of these buildings. And so it remains dry to this day. The good news is that everybody would like to see a watered raceway again. It is going to cost millions of dollars to make that happen, but there is a willingness, both financially and with the expertise, to engineer such a thing to make it happen. And this is basically the raceway system from the top. It's about a mile long, and some of it is remains under streets that you can no longer see today, but you're driving over it. And it is something that we interpret, and it's probably one of the more significant cultural artifacts that we have in the park boundary. And again, this just shows how the raceway would work, connected to belts, which are connected to these shafts, connected to the machines. Pretty ingenious system. Now, over time, the SUM wanted to get people off of the raceway. The city was growing. People were thirsty. They needed fresh drinking water. You couldn't keep sucking too much water away from the river itself to put into running the mills. Plus, the only way that you could actually get power to your mills is if you had a seat along the raceway, which is, you know, something you would have rented out from the SUM, and that's how the SUM made their money. So if the city wanted to grow it all, you needed to get people onto something more sustainable, and that was electricity. So they did build this hydroelectric plant here in 1914. It works the same way as the raceway, except instead of going into a channel, they take water off of the river up in here. It goes down into the turbines, which are down below, and that's how it generates the power to run the mills. Now, the hydroelectric plant is working today, and it has enough. When all of the turbines are running, which is not often, but when volume allows, it is enough to power approximately 10,000 homes. What happens is that the city of Patterson holds, has a lease agreement with a company, and then they sell that electricity to PSE&G. They also had built a steam plant because sometimes the river's just not flowing as well as you would have hoped. And you can't tell people, I'm sorry, I can't get you your sweater because the river is running low and I can't run my machines. So in those times, there would be a coal-powered steam plant that would generate power when the rivers ran low. And this was knocked down in the 1960s. Now, just to kind of get an idea, these are the turbines, at least a historic view. And this is the more modern view. Okay, so let's continue on with some of the people. I mentioned Peter Colt. Now we have Samuel Colt. He did develop a new type of revolver, which kind of revolutionized the industry. I like to think, I don't know why it keeps changing on its own, so I apologize for that. I don't know what happened, but basically with Samuel Colt, I like to think of Paterson as an incubator site, and as such, ideas get generated here, and they're good ideas, but it doesn't always mean that they're successful in Paterson. And Samuel Colt is a perfect example of that. Everybody loved his gun, but there was no market for it, not right away. It was peacetime. The United States, he was hoping to get a government contract, but there were no wars. So after he sold about 5,000 units, he basically had to close up shop. He moved back to Connecticut where his family was. And not long after the Mexican War started, the government was looking at weaponry. Samuel Colt got his government contract, and the rest is history. So much so that Coltsville, which is in Connecticut, is actually one of the National Park Service's newest national park sites. So what happened to his factory? Well, part of his factory was rented out to a man named John Ryle and another Colt relative, and they started to produce silk there. In fact, John Ryle is kind of known as the father of the silk industry because he basically made it happen, but it also provided jobs for people who needed to flee other countries, which are listed below, to help better themselves economically. Sometimes a group of people are not able to get jobs in other countries due to bias, etc. And we know all too well about that. So they came here looking for a better life. And Alexander Hamilton's view was, we want people from abroad. Our people who are already here, we don't know a lot of what's going on in latest and greatest technology, because when we were colonies of Great Britain, they wouldn't allow us to have that. So please, let's just get the best and the brightest from overseas to help jumpstart our economy. And they did come and made Patterson known as the Silk City. Now, because this is a program done at Temple Israel, I just wanted to point out some of the highlights of Jewish history in Patterson. B'nai Yeshurun being, the first incorporated synagogue in the state of New Jersey. I also like to bring up Nathan Barnard. His story is really pretty amazing. Started off as a guy who got caught up in the gold rush, went out west, and instead of mining for gold, he decided to mine the pockets of the miners that were out there by selling them things that they needed. He came back home. He eventually made uniforms that were used for the Union Army during the Civil War. He kind of ended his entrepreneurial career in terms of industry at 40, so that he can move on with that entrepreneurial spirit to support more of Patterson by building other factories to provide more jobs. Eventually, he became a great philanthropist in the community. He became mayor, and a statue is actually erected in front of City Hall and remains to this day. A couple of other people I like to point out are Larry Dobby, who was the first person to break the color barrier for the American League. He was from Eastside High School. He did play in Henchlift Stadium, which is a Negro League, one of a few Negro League stadiums still in existence. We have Juno Diaz, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner, who wrote a book, who wrote a book and kind of draws on the Patterson experience for that book. And these are just a whole bunch of other people that I don't expect you to read. I'm putting it up here because, and this is kind of a thing where I can at least get folks to participate, maybe not in real time, but maybe a little later, is we are setting up exhibits in our, for a visitor center that we hope to get started on building later this year. And to that end, we want to highlight people that kind of demonstrate that entrepreneurial spirit. And we don't have a whole lot of space because we're not a museum. We want to whet the appetite just enough so that people will want to go on a ranger program or visit the Patterson Museum or visit the Labor Museum, also known as the Botto House, or Lambert's Castle, to learn more. So who would you recommend to be on such a list? You will have my email address at the end of this program, and I will put it in the chat, and I welcome any and all ideas to help inform our exhibits. Many of you may have read William Carlos Williams' epic poem, Paterson. Many of you may know Howell and Allen Ginsberg, who also hailed from Paterson. But how many times have we seen Oscar Blumner's exhibits? I had the opportunity to see it when it was, there was an exhibit at the Montclair Art Museum, and he liked to paint Patterson's factories and the raceways, but he specifically chose the color red to paint his buildings. And you might think, well, red, of course, because the brick, but the brick buildings aren't this bright red. He did it this way on purpose. Anybody want to put in the chat a guess as to why, what he was trying to say by painting the buildings red? Any guesses? Well, if you said political statement, you'd be right. Yes, the communists. Thank you, Tova. Yes. So he was trying to make a statement. So what's the statement? Well, Patterson had a number of strikes, and perhaps the most famous of them was the 1913 silk strike. Walkers went off the job, and ostensibly people think that, oh, well, of course the working conditions were horrible and they wanted more money. That actually really wasn't the reason why they went on strike. It became the reason why they went on strike. What happened is that technology was moving along, and what used to take 4 people to run a machine for making a silk product now took only 2 people. So what does that mean? That means people are going to be out of a job. So people went on strike, and first it was the skilled laborers, followed by the unskilled laborers, and it was a major strike, especially when you think that nearly 50% of all of the world's silk, came from Paterson, New Jersey. So this was a big, big deal. And what happened is when the Paterson silk strikers, walked out, the mayor of Paterson at the time, who names escapes me, so if anybody knows, please put in the chat, said, yeah, no, you can't meet and you can't strike in Paterson because anybody who would strike against their employer is obviously a communist, and we don't accept communists here. Well, the mayor of Halden said, huh, interesting. Well, I am a socialist and y'all can't strike in Paterson. Why don't y'all come and meet here? So they did. They met at the Botto House, which was owned by the Botto family, and they did work in the silk, if you will. They had an area that would allow for all of these people to congregate, and a beautiful balcony where people would come and in different languages be able to speak to the diverse populace about what's going on in the strike, where you could get some assistance while you are on strike for food, etc. And one of the leaders of the silk strike was actually a 17-year-old, and that is Hannah Silverman, who is somebody I definitely would like to see in our exhibit, but that's a shameless plug, so ignore that. Children also went on strike in the 1830s. Their major issue was they wanted to work 11 hours instead of 13 and a half. And they didn't want to work a full day on Saturday. They only wanted to work 9 hours on Saturday. They weren't actually complaining about the money. Many of the strikers were girls. There were no unions, of course, but there were guilds, and other newspapers throughout New Jersey did actually report on the children that walked out and said, hey, we should definitely, support them in whatever way we can. So those are the people. The economic vision, well, that's basically Patterson's products. And unlike a lot of other towns, like say Olola, Massachusetts, which makes every single textbook on the planet and unfortunately doesn't make any textbooks, Patterson doesn't generally make the textbooks. We had a diversity of our product line, which is shown in these pictures here. And this is just some of the industries that we had in Patterson. What's good about it is when one industry went bust, there was another industry ready to take over. Kind of like a healthy ecosystem. Now, I did want to point out that I looked at the time, and I am going over. So I just wanted to ask if people would like me to hurry this up a bit.
No, we're fine.
Okay, because I can keep going. So one of the industries that we had here was the silk industry. We not only, we basically dyed the silk, we put it on spindles, we wove it into patterns. I noticed in the chat, somebody had mentioned oh my gosh, I'm sorry about that. Somebody had mentioned the Jacquard Loom. This is the Jacquard Loom. Those of you that are computer people would recognize, oh, look at this, punch cards. Yes, it is like an early computer. The patterns would be pre-punched, and you would put it in your machine, and then it would weave for you. What you see in the GIF on the lower right is your typical shuttle and cock type of loom, which was also used, but again, technology since moved on. If you want to see a Jacquard loom and quite frankly, a really good silk exhibit, you definitely want to go to the Patterson Museum when they reopen. Right now, it is currently closed because of COVID. Okay, the paper-making industry. We did have a robust paper-making industry. One of the things that, that's a Patterson, actually an American first, is most of the time when you make paper, back in the day, it was one page at a time. Of course, now that's really inefficient. And if you take one of these machines, the Foundrinder machine, which was actually invented in Europe, you can actually make a ream of paper, which is much more efficient. And the first time that this technology was actually used in the United States was in Paterson, the Passaic Paper Manufacturing Company. We also want to point out the Ivanhoe paper mill, which is within the park boundary. The powerhouse still exists. And someday we hope to get, it would be nice to have the city rehabilitate that structure so we could get people inside of it. But we definitely will interpret it in our programming. I'm so sorry about this. There we go. Somebody mentioned railroads. So yes, we definitely have a railroad industry. And one of the things I wanted to point out was that Thomas Rogers, who's pictured, the Rogers Locomotive Company is pictured on the lower left. They wound up being the largest locomotive manufacturer in the city of Paterson at one time. And what I like about his story is that he actually started off making machines for the silk industry. And when the silk industry went bust, he could have folded and walked away, but instead he retooled, he reinvented himself and the factory. And that's when they started, instead of making machines for silk, they started making locomotives. He actually had a locomotive. He basically took one apart, because we didn't make them here, they made them overseas. And he learned how to put it together and became one of the most successful locomotive manufacturers in the country. 4 different companies were making steam locomotives. This is actually a finished train coming out of one of those buildings. They put it together from soup to nuts in Patterson. They were shipped all over the world, and some of the rolling stock, because I guess you can't technically call it a locomotive, is this snowplow here. It would actually blow snow off of the railroad tracks, and it was, I believe, one of these pictures. I think this particular picture was of one that was used out on Long Island, which is where I hail from. So I'm pretty excited about that. You can see some of this rolling stock today. There are a couple of engines outside the Patterson Museum, but you can also visit our sister park over in Scranton, and it is called Steamtown. One of the Rogers locomotives that made it famous was Locomotive 119. It was one of the 2 trains that went across country. Obviously, the westbound train that met over in Utah for the Golden Spike ceremony, which recently had its anniversary. Another train is the Sierra 3 train, which some people call the movie star train. It's been, anytime they pretty much need a steam train, it's probably Sierra number 3. But some of the places you might have seen it is in Back to the Future 3. It had a starring role, actually. And in Little House on the Prairie. For those of you that know your Little House on the Prairie, it was the episode with the runaway yellow caboose. If you do visit the Patterson Museum, you will see Locomotive 299 out in front. And that's one of the few locomotives remaining from its job down at the Panama Canal. There were about 246 locomotives that were used in Panama, basically to haul away dirt to make the canal. And 144 of them were in Paterson. This one was actually appropriated by Mayor Kramer, who was on our advisory committee when we were planning the park. And I say acquired because he actually managed to quote unquote borrow it from Panama and decided just not to return it. So here it is in Paterson. That story is actually on our website. We have a bunch of oral histories, and Mayor Kramer tells that story in his. Other people to point out, we have Wright's Aeronautical, the Allied Textile Printers, and of course, we couldn't move on without talking about John Philip Holland, who was a mathematics teacher in Patterson, who was kind of this, submarine buff. and he produced the first usable submarine, and it was adopted by the U.S. Navy, and the original Holland submarine, as well as his later versions, are on display at the Patterson Museum. Charles Lindbergh's plane, Amelia Earhart's plane, they both had engines that were made at Wright Aeronautics. So now we're at the last big theme, right? So we have people, we have places, we have products, we have diversity. But when you talk about cities, you tend to see this cycle of an upswing followed by a downswing. And it is true of every city. Think about New York City in the 1970s. So it kind of begs the question, so what happens next? So the story continues because the place is still here, but now the Park Service is here too. And so are you. People are putting in the chat things that they know about Paterson because they're from Paterson. And the only way to keep the history alive is to tell the stories. So one of the ways we do that is to make sure we tell the stories, which is why we have a general management plan, which you can link to from our website, which basically talks about things that we like that can happen in the park that would allow us to tell such stories. Some of the things that were actually put in the general management plan have actually occurred already. And there is a video that I wanted to show, but because it's getting late, I could show that at the end for people that are interested, but let's talk about some future plans. Overlook Park has recently been redone. We now have an amphitheater. This area is the Allied Textile Printing site here. And we are going to create a pocket park, the groundbreaking for which will hopefully also be sometime this year. Unfortunately, this is what it looks like today. We plan to have a river walk to stabilize the structures and provide water conservation and ecology education. We envision the park looking something along these lines. This is not set in stone. This is just see what can be done in that entrepreneurial spirit. The raceway system I had mentioned we would like to bring back. So we're going to improve the trails. We'd like to improve the pipelines and the pump valves, somehow have the reservoir looped into the trail. You can walk through Upper Raceway Park now, of which this is a picture, but there's no water in it. It's going to cost somewhere around $5 million or so. But like I said, the commitment and the expertise is there. We want to improve some of our trails. And the kids that do that are part of our Great Falls Youth Corps, and some of them have actually moved on to seasonal park ranger jobs with us at the park. The Stoney Ridge Trail came online a few years ago. This is a rendering of our proposed visitor center, which will be about $24 million when it's done. All donations. People have asked about Henchlift Stadium. It is a National Historic Landmark. It was the place for the Negro Leagues. But let's not forget the midget car racing, as well as, Duke Ellington played there. Boxing matches were held there. It was a very vibrant place, and the groundbreaking is happening April 14th to start the rehabilitation, the next phase of its rehabilitation. The city obtained $40 million in state tax credits to put towards this project, and it's going to become a sports venue again that could also be used by the city schools. We will always interpret its history, of course, and there will be a small visitor center in there to talk about Henchlift's history. And here's just some renderings. This is the work that's been done so far. This has all been fixed up. And I did mention heritage tourism, being an economic engine, that every dollar spent in the national park on average, and that's about $10 of revenue for the gateway community to the park. So some of the things that we do to kind of help help with this is our education initiatives. We do guided tours. We are doing it through COVID. When most national parks saw a decline in visitation, us being an outdoor park, we actually saw an increase, a significant increase in visitation. We're giving tours now, but by reservation only to be mindful of COVID. We give educational programs as well as host special events. And again, I'm just checking the time at 8:57. And I'm wondering if this is a good place to stop and take some questions, or do you want to see more pictures?
This is a good place to stop and take some questions.
Very good.
I think you might have seen it in chat. People want to know, when will guided tours be available?
Well, guided tours are available now, but by reservation only. Again, we're trying to keep the number of people on our tours small because of COVID. What you do is you go on our website and you put in a reservation form, and then we schedule a tour. We try to put a couple of groups together, but if that can't happen, if you're a group of one, we'll give a tour for a group of one. So you don't have to be part of an organized group to actually come have a tour. And somebody asked what the website is, so I'm going to type it in right now. Any other questions?
At least this is Eric Weiss. You mentioned Scranton, and I've been there because I've got a house not that far away.
Oh, very nice.
You know if it's open, there's a lot of outdoor stuff there, but the roundhouse and the internal museum, do you know if it's open or not?
I don't. I would have you go to their website just to find out, because as I kind of mentioned earlier before the talk, every park has to go by the guidelines of the state and local governments for what's appropriate for COVID. And so you really do have to visit every single park website to find out what's open and what's not. And it changes pretty often. So I'm just going to put their website in the chat.
Great.
I'm also going to put my email in the chat so that people can email me their wonderful ideas.
And one other,
Elise,
I'm sorry. One other comment. You mentioned Wright Aeronautical, and my father worked for Wright Aeronautical. And I don't know if it's well known, but at the end of World War II, Wright was larger than General Motors. It was an enormous, and it was mostly here in New Jersey. And it still is a much smaller version of it, but incredibly proud history.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that, you know, we have so much to talk about. And so these are one of the programs that we would want to be able to provide for park visitors, you know, like a specialty program just on Wright's Aeronautics. So you have my email. So would love to, you know, hear some ideas or comments or pictures, or, you know, what your family experienced when they worked there.
Elise, this is Tova. Are the Ramapo Nation or tribe considered part of the Lenape?
So this brings up a very interesting question. Okay. So we have done programming with the Ramapo. In fact, the Ramapo, which are also known as like the Munsee, if you look dialectically, it's the Munsee that are actually most closely associated with the Great Falls area. That's not to say that other Lenape tribes are not closely associated. It's because the Lenape had, you know, Lenapehoking, which is the tribal lands, included all of New Jersey. Now, to answer the specific question, the answer is yes, but there are only 3 federally recognized tribes. And so when we work with the tribal nations, it's kind of a thing, you know, if we're going to work with the 3 federally recognized tribes on an initiative, we are not including the non-federally recognized tribes by their request. And as a federal site ourselves, that's who we work with. That is not to say we wouldn't continue doing programming with the non-federally recognized tribes. if that makes any sense.
So let me interrupt now, Elise. I wanted to, for the purposes of recording, we're going to bring this to a close. So first, let me extend my personal thanks and thanks on behalf of Temple Israel on your presentation this evening. It was extremely interesting and learned a whole lot, and looking forward to actually taking that tour. Hopefully not with a tour of one, but with many who join us now that the weather has turned better. A real great education. Also, we know that there were a lot of Jews who came from that Patterson area. That was a very interesting comment about the silk industry, and people who had experience from Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe came to this country to find work and ended up in Patterson because of the mill work. And of course, the Patterson community is not what it once was, but interesting, as you said, about how cities rise and fall. So again, on behalf of Temple Israel, let me say thank you.
Thank you. I really, I mean, I'm sorry it was so long. I'm kind of a desk jockey right now.
No,
So
I don't think any apologies are necessary. It was very rich and rewarding and informative, and those are all the things that we can ask. And after we go off recording, if anyone would like to ask questions, they can. I just did want to mention that next Monday at 7:30 on Monday, Elaine Silverstein on gardening and compost and lawns. I've seen it before. It's very worthwhile. So let me say thank you for that and come off recording.